Now, in the previous week, we discussed about research ethics, and also we discussed about, if I'm not mistaken, let me quickly check, uh, about research questions. Now, today we are going to start with measurements. Now, uh, so far we have some understanding about how to do the research, and we discussed about how to develop a question, how to picture the particular research, and maybe develop a little conceptual diagram, how to have our objectives, how to have our research questions, and then how to have our hypothesis. Now, with that, I am going to discuss measurements today. Now, if let's say you have developed a particular research, once you have developed this research, how are we going to go ahead and measure? Now, the most common method is, of course, uh, having some, if you have some scales, you could go ahead and collect your data. That is something that you can, of course, do. But we have to understand the logic behind using this kind of scales. Why exactly we use these scales, and how do we know it measures what it's supposed to be measuring? So today we are going to understand measurements in research, and how to differentiate levels of measurement, types of variables, and types of scales. So this is exactly what we are going to understand today. Last week, we just discussed about variables, but we are going to make more differentiation among different variables we have. And at the same time, we are going to understand different levels of measurement and how each variable can be measured using these methods that we'll be discussing today. Now, if we want to do a small research, everyone knows that we have to measure something. For example, let's say if you get a class, if you get not just a class, but if you get a particular school grade, let's say the sixth graders, how is their performance for science, mathematics, and social studies? So then, of course, we have to give them an exam paper. That's the only method that we are going to assess their marks or assess their level of learning. So exam is a particular type of measurement. You measure someone's understanding of different concepts, the degree to which someone has retained the things the curriculum is supposed to be teaching someone. So things like that. Now, if you consider the inflation rate of the present times in Sri Lanka, now of course that is also measured. So there's a clear method to measure these things. But when you want to measure, there are different levels in this measurement, or there are different types of measurements rather. Now, for example, we have four general types of measurement. We call them nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. Now, nominal type of measurements are usually categorical. As the name suggests, you can't actually directly go ahead and measure them. For example, let's say if I ask you to go to your room, open your closet, and try to find how many red color clothes you have, how many green color clothes you have, how many yellow color and blue color clothes you have, from red to green to yellow to blue, there is no method of exactly measuring them. But however, we can make the frequencies. For example, how many red colored dresses I have, how many green colored dresses I have, how many yellow colored dresses I have, and how many blue colored dresses I have. Nominal means they are different categories. You can't measure the category, but you can calculate how many people identify with this particular category, how many things identify with this category. For example, uh, how many, what percentage of people in Sri Lanka are Buddhists? So, for example, Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, and Christians. Now, these are religious categories. So, if you consider, that's a nominal variable. Religion is a nominal variable because different religions, you can't measure them, but those are just categories. For example, gender. There are different gender categories now. At least when we were young, there were two categories, but now in the Western world, people are saying there are more gender categories. So each category, you can't directly measure it, but You can calculate frequencies, how many people are men, how many people are women, or how many identify themselves otherwise. So likewise, so this is nominal variables. You can't measure them, but these are just categories. Now, there's another type of a variable called ordinal variable. Ordinal variable is also categorical, but the thing here is, unlike the previous categories that we discussed earlier, here you would see some sort of an increment. For example, I can go to a shop and I can try to find different sizes of clothes. For example, there are smaller clothes, medium sized clothes, large, extra large, and double XL. Now, small, medium, large, yes, we can't measure them. But from small to medium and from medium to large, there's a visible increment. For example, if you get different age categories, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, 40 to 50, likewise. And if you get, for example, anything, uh, meal sizes and portions, if you go to some restaurants, they have kiddie size, the regular size, and the extra large, meal. So the meal size of clothes, and things like that, these are usually ordinal variables. Because once again, this is categorical, but unlike religion, ethnicity, and gender, here you would see some sort of an increment. So nominal and ordinal variables, both of these, we call them categorical variables because you see categories. But unlike them, if you go to interval and ratio, the story is a little bit different. Now, interval scale, so if you get this, you would find everything to be numerical. Now, there are no categories, but if you measure something using the interval type of measurement, you would deal with numbers. But here you have no absolute 0 point. So, for example, something like temperature. If you get temperature, now temperature, of course, has to be measured with numbers. So, if someone says, if you think about the temperature right now, let's say it is 25. So, I am in Candy right now. Here it's about 25 right now. So 25 Celsius. But if you go to Nuvarelia, probably it would be about, let's say, 7 degrees or 8 degrees Celsius. What does it mean if the temperature drops down to 0? 0 is also a temperature and it is very cold. And the temperature could go below 0 as well, which means -5, -10. Now, if you go to United States right now, some of the northern states might have minus temperatures. So in something like temperature, 0 doesn't mean nothing, it means something. So things like that, we usually call them interval types of variables. So they are, the type of measurement is interval. And then again, you have ratio. Once again, this is also numerical, but here you have absolute 0. For example, income. Now, unlike temperature, if someone says my income is 0, which means you don't have any income. And if you say my age is 0, which means you are technically not in this world. If you say your weight is 0, then it pretty much means you don't have a physical body. So ratio scale and interval scale, they both deal with numbers. But in ratio, there is an absolute 0. So if you give an exam paper to school students, there the 0 means it's an absolute 0. So the exam paper comes under ratio level of, ratio scales. But if you measure temperature, that is interval. If you measure t-shirt sizes, shirt sizes, shoe sizes, and stuff like that, it would be categorical. And then religion, ethnicity, gender, those would be nominal variables. Now, these are just 4 different types of variables. So, nominal and ordinal come under the discrete variable category or categorical variables because they consist of separate, indivisible categories. If you get red cannot be divided into multiple parts because red is red, green is green. So that is exactly what happens when you have categorical variables. But if you get variables like interval and ratio, we call them continuous variables, because in between two values, you have infinite number of possibilities. Let's say right now the temperature is 25. It's going to be 26 in the next few moments. In between 25 and 26, you can come to a midpoint, 25.5. In between 25 and 25.5, you have another midpoint, and another midpoint, and another midpoint, and this will continue to an infinity. So, something like that. If you get income, even if someone says, I have right now 100 rupees with me, and you have 102 rupees with me, what's the midpoint of both of these? Yes, there's a midpoint for that. And likewise, if you get two numbers, there will be multiple possible values that could fall between any two observed values. So this is what we call a continuous variable. So a continuous variable is divisible into an infinite number of fractional parts. Okay, so now these are the four levels of measurements or particular types of variables we would notice. Now, those types are related to how you are going to measure this, okay? Now, in addition to that, I think briefly mentioned last week about independent variables and dependent variables. Now, independent variable and dependent variables usually come in experimental research. If you want to find cause and effect of something, you have to do experimental research. And whenever you do a study, then you need to have an independent variable and a dependent variable. So before we move and try to understand this in depth, you have to have some understanding about what makes an independent variable an independent variable. So let me explain something like this. Now, let's try to get an example here. Let's say there's a researcher, and this researcher is interested in finding whether frustration could make people aggressive. Okay, so this is the particular research this person is interested in finding. Now here, if you notice, there are two variables. The first variable is frustration, and the next variable is aggression. Now there are two ways to find what an independent variable is and what a dependent variable is. Now, understanding independent variables and dependent variables in experimental research is slightly different, because in experimental research, you are supposed to be manipulating the first variable, this frustration variable. I will explain how exactly you are going to do this. Now, frustration and aggression is the research that I want to do. But how exactly I am going to do this in an experiment? I can do a very easy thing. That is, I can get about 60 students, divide the students into two parts as 30 students, 30 students. I am going to frustrate one group. I am going to keep the other group without getting frustrated. And then towards the end, I can measure their aggression. Now, aggression is the variable that I am interested in measuring. I want to measure aggression. So aggression, of course, is my dependent variable, because this is the variable I am interested in measuring. But I can measure this based on the manipulation that I do in my independent variable. For example, I divided my group into two, 30 students in one group and 30 students in another. I randomly assign people into these two groups so that I could check whether being frustrated or not has some changes in their aggression score. So when we discuss about the experimental designs, this will be even further clear to you. But for the time being, I'm going to just write it as independent variable. Now, as I was teaching research, one of the biggest questions I always had was how to explain independent variable and dependent variable in a clear way. if we haven't discussed about experimental research. Now, whenever you go through a research title, one of the first questions you need to ask to identify the independent and the dependent variable is this. I'm going to write it here. Which variable influences the other variable? Now, there are two variables, right? What is the variable that will influence the other variable? One variable always have some impact on the other. So what is that variable? Now let's go through this example here. Here it says the role of organizational commitment and autonomy in employee turnover intentions. What does this say? Turnover intentions means desire to leave the organization. Commitment, of course, we understand what commitment is. Autonomy means being able to work without getting too much instructed on what needs to be done on a daily basis. So if you are committed, if you are autonomous, probably there is no need for you to go out from the existing job. But if you don't feel you are committed, you have no autonomy, probably you might be thinking of quitting your job. Now this is exactly what we plan on finding in this particular research. The role of organizational commitment and autonomy in employee turnover intentions. Now here you have three variables. Organizational commitment is one variable. Autonomy is one variable. Turnover intentions is one variable. Now ask the question, which variables influence the other variable, or which variable influences the other variable? Now here, if you go through this title, organizational commitment and autonomy are the two variables that influence someone's turnover intentions. This is why I have colored organizational commitment and autonomy in red and turnover intentions in blue. If I want to leave my organization, what exactly is influencing me? Commitment and autonomy, according to this title. So then the variables that influencing me are the independence. So here in the title, the variables that influence are the independence. So organizational commitment and autonomy are independence. And turnover intention is the dependent because we are trying to measure it. Okay. Now let's go through a few examples. When we go through a few examples, this will be even further clear. Okay. Now, let's go through this. Here I have given 7 titles. Let's try to understand the independent and the dependent variable here. Okay, the first title, this one. Study examining if television violence increases aggression in children. Now ask the same question again. Let me get the question from the previous page. Which variable influences the other variable? So for example, study examining if television violence increases aggression. So what increases aggression in children? Television violence. So then television violence should be your independent variable, because the study examines if television violence increases aggression in children. So then aggression needs to be the dependent variable. This is the variable you are interested in measuring. You want to measure aggression, but you want to see whether violence could make a difference in aggression. For example, students who watch horror movies could experience more aggression compared to students who would watch romantic movies. So the type of movie could have an impact on someone's aggression. So here we are measuring aggression against whether the TV would have violence or not. Okay. Now let's go through the second one here. Study predicting that alcohol drinking will decrease people's reaction times while driving. So if I'm driving, if my reaction time is affected by alcohol, so what exactly does this say? So it is alcohol that changes my reaction time. So then alcohol is the influencing factor here. So alcohol drinking is my independent variable, and reaction time is my dependent variable, because we are interested in measuring dependent variable, and we are going to see whether this particular reaction time changes if people take alcohol, maybe based on the amount of alcohol they take, or maybe based on whether they have alcohol or not. So something like that. So then this independent variable, you always need to have some categories. Okay, you need to have minimum two groups. Without any group, you can't go ahead and have an independent variable. For example, let's say I want to do a study where I am interested in measuring whether alcohol drinking has something to do with reaction time. So then I can get about, let's say, 60 people. I divide them into three groups: 20, 20, 20. First group, they are not given alcohol. Second group, they are given some alcohol. But for the third group, we have given them substantial amount of alcohol. Now I have three groups. These three groups come under my independent variable, alcohol drinking. You need to have at least two groups if you want to measure. So here I have now three groups: those who don't drink, those who drink a little, and those who drink a lot. So I have given them alcohol in these particular amounts, and then I am going to see whether this alcohol intake has something to do with the reaction times. So I am interested in measuring the reaction time, but based on the alcohol intake. So the alcohol intake, which is my independent variable, I have divided into three groups and put people in all three groups so that I could actually see what exactly is happening. So this is exactly what we call, manipulating our variable. So if you can take a variable, can divide it into a few groups and randomly put people into these groups so that you could do your study, usually that variable is what we call the independent variable, the variable that you can manipulate, which also is the variable that would influence the other variable. So when you go through multiple examples, it will be more clear to you. It is just that since this is the first time that we go through this, it might look like, slightly here and there, but it will all make sense when we move forward in the rest of the classes, okay? So here I have given a few more examples as well. Let's take another one here. How do changes in workspace affect employee reaction? So changes in workspace, that's the independent variable. Employee reaction, that is the dependent variable. Now, whenever you think of a study, you need to have a few variables, and always there needs to be an independent variable and a dependent variable. Even in the previous weeks, whatever the research that we discussed, all of them had an independent variable and a dependent variable. Now, of course, the word independent variable is subjected to a lot of things depending on the study method and designs and all of that. This terminology will change, but I am not going to focus on that here. I will be focusing on this at a very general level to help all of you understand what the independent variable is all about and what the dependent variable is all about. Now, this is what we discussed. There are four types of variables: nominal, ordinal, interval, ratio, depending on how you measure them. And then we have independent variables and dependent variables. Okay. Now, here's the interesting part. Now you have variables. We know we have variables. But how exactly are we going to measure these things? For example, television violence and aggression. Let's get aggression here. Aggression is a variable that you want to measure. Now I'm going to copy this and put this in the next page. Okay. Now I have a variable. Aggression. Now the $1,000,000 question is how exactly I am going to measure this particular variable. Now, if it is weight, yes, we can ask the person to step on a weighing scale and we can measure weight. If it is age, we can actually measure that very easily. But how exactly are we going to measure aggression? That is not something that I can directly go and ask from a person. Can I ask from a person from 1 to 10, can you rate how aggressive you are right now? They might say I am 8, I am 9, or maybe I am 2. But whether someone's understanding about their aggression, is it true or false? We don't know. So it is not a very objective method of measuring aggression. Unlike most of the other fields in research, in psychological research, one of the biggest problems we have is we are dealing with things in our mind. So things in the mind is very difficult to be demonstrated outside. So it's very difficult to measure. Mental states are very difficult to measure. So words like now, these variables like aggression, happiness, guilt, depression, anxiety, anything you can pretty much imagine, we call them constructs. Okay? Constructs. Because these are internal attributes of a person and we can't directly observe. If you say you are happy right now, but if you don't laugh or if you don't smile or if you don't do anything specific, how can I know whether you are happy or sad? I can't. Some people, when they are sad, they cry. Some people, when they are sad, they go out and play. So, how do I know whether the person is sad or not? It is something the person is internally experiencing. So, how can I go ahead and measure this? That's the biggest problem. So, these are all constructs. Constructs. So, we can't directly measure them because it is something the person is internally experiencing. So, we have to figure out a method to measure it. We call it the operational definition. Operational definition identifies a measurement procedure for measuring external behavior and uses the resulting measurement to, as a definition and a measurement for the hypothetical construct. Okay, now that's a bit complicated, but let me explain here. Now, there are internal attributes. No, this internal attribute you can observe through a person's behavior. If you are sad or if you are happy, you will not directly tell it to others, but you might execute certain behaviors that would indicate whether you are happy or sad. So, in psychological research, since we cannot directly measure the mental state, what we do is we measure the observable behaviors, whatever you can see outside of a person related to this, we measure those. Think like this. Now, for example, let's say if someone is aggressive, what kind of behaviors will they show others? For example, talking loud. Some people, when they're aggressive, they talk loud. Some people, when they're aggressive, they start to, scream, or maybe they start to blame others. And some people, when they are really aggressive, they start to, breathe differently as well. So their breathing changes. So the breathing might change as well. So these are all different changes you would see. And I can't see whether the person is aggressive or not directly, but I can always see whether someone is talking loud or not. I can always see whether someone is screaming loud or not. And I can always see whether the breathing changes in a person or not, because these are all observable things. These observable things explain what is happening internally in a person. This is exactly how we understand the method of, this is exactly how we measure an internal attributes or mental state of a person. This is a very simple explanation. This is the construct aggression, and aggression can be made measurable with a set of procedures, of which here I have only selected these three. But let me explain this to you using an original scale. Now, there's a particular scale called DAS 21, Depression, Anxiety, Stress Scale 21. So this scale can measure depression, anxiety, and stress of a person. It can give you a numeric score. Okay, this is the depression score that you have, this is the anxiety score you have, and this is the stress score that you have. Now, if you just go through this, see, here it says emotional state. This is the emotional state of a person. So, to understand the emotional state, here we are using depression, anxiety, and stress. Now, depression, of course, is something the person is experiencing internally. I can't directly observe it. But although depression is the experience is different from one person to another, there are some common experiences people will have or people go through, and there are certain common things that they will demonstrate outside, and you will be able to observe as well. See, for example, a depressed person might have no positive feeling, no initiative, nothing to look forward to, downhearted, unable to become enthusiastic, feels like they don't worth much, and might think their life is meaningless. So these are all things that you can ask from the person. Do you think your life is meaningless? Might say yes. Do you think you are a worthless person? Might say yes. Have you found yourself that you have lost enthusiasm recently? Might say yes. So, likewise, these are all observable things. These observable things indicate whether the person has depression or not. So, if you want to measure depression, you can't directly just ask, hey, do you have depression? Probably everyone might say yes, depending on the situation all of us are in right now. But no, depression can be assessed through questions like this. Now, you might probably ask, what if these questions are wrong? Yes, if these questions are wrong, you won't be able to measure it properly. That's the thing. So there's a particular field in psychology called psychometrics. So they are the individuals, they make these kind of scales, and their expertise is to develop these scales in such a way that they will be valid and reliable. So that's a whole different topic, and we won't be able to discuss it today. But if time permits, in one of the upcoming days, we will discuss some of the basics of that. But this is basically how you would measure. Unlike weight, income, and all of that, which you can directly measure, things like depression, anxiety, stress, we can't directly measure. So you have to have operational definitions. So when you have operational definitions, you can convert this construct to a variable. Okay, construct, you have to convert it to a variable. You have to have some operational definition so that this can be converted from a construct to a variable. Now see here, the same topic that we were discussing earlier, the role of organizational commitment and autonomy in employee turnover intentions. Here turnover intentions are being they have operationalized turnover intentions by asking two questions. The first one is, it is likely that I will leave my job within the next year. And the second one is, I often feel like quitting my job. So the person is given a chance to rate this from 1 to 5. So if someone rates 20, sorry, 10, because the first one, the highest you can score is 5. The second, the highest you can score is 5. So if someone scores a combined score of 10 for both of these, which means that person has the highest likelihood to go out. And if someone scores 2, that person has the least likelihood to go. And similarly, there would be a lot of other individuals with values in between. Now, this is a very simple method of operationalizing a construct. But you can make this operationalization process far more strong by adding more relevant questions so that you can get a better understanding about the intention of the person to leave. So this is just a very simple scale, and there are different types of scales. The most commonly used scale is what we call the Likert scale. And there are other scales like Bogade's social distance scale, Gutman scale, Thurston scale, semantic differential scale. So here's an example of a Likert scale. See here, if you look at this, I like stock market, strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. Now, even in this example, turnover intentions, it is likely that I will leave my job within the next year. You can say strongly agree, slightly agree, neutral, slightly disagree, disagree. Likewise, and then you can put the numbers to them so that you can calculate the overall score of a person for this construct. This is how exactly we pull out numbers in this kind of survey type of research. Now, that's the Likert scale. This is an example of the semantic differential scale. And here you have the Bogadas social distance scale. Now, this social distance scale is also, it's slightly different from the Likert scale. So here I have given one example. Now, usually we don't use these other types way too often. The ones that we commonly use is the Likert scale. So this Likert scale actually can be utilized. Now, if you consider even this DAS 21, they also have the same Likert, format. So if you go through most of the surveys that you will receive in internet or the ones that you usually go through, uh, to test your personality and stuff like that, they usually have Likert scales. So that is exactly how you can understand different types of measurement and also how those measurements can be effectively utilized in psychological research so that we could gather more data and analyze and then report our findings. Now that we know how to do this, how to use these measurements appropriately, suppose we have collected data. So the next thing that we want to find is how to go ahead and do some basic analysis. Okay, so that is exactly what we are going to discuss next.